latest webinar exploring how to help senior leaders to press the pause button. It's great to see that there's been a lot of interest in this topic, as it's something that we've been focusing on here at Farscape for the last 18 months as part of our own programme design with senior teams. It sounds like a relatively simple thing to do, but what we know from working with many leaders in organisations is that it is one of the things that they struggle with the most, hence the reason for putting on this webinar today. Our interest in the topic really stems from doing an increasing amount of work with our clients and their senior teams to improve their behavioural flexibility and making conscious behavioural choices rather than having unconscious reactions. And part of the skill in doing this is being able to stop, to pause and to reflect. So none of what I'm going to cover today is new, but what we've done is pull together the lessons that we've learned about why it's important and how we can help individuals and businesses to recognise the value that being more reflective can deliver. So before we get stuck in, I just want to do some introductions to let you know who is going to be joining me today on the webinar. So first of all, the picture of me there at the top, my name's Ruth Moody and I'm the Managing Director here at Farscape. Over the 13 years that we've been running, I've become more and more interested in how we can help people to stop and think. I think the temptation as a people development consultancy is to focus on content. So what are the things that we can teach people that are tangible models and tools? And it's an interesting conversation that we often have with our clients when they're talking to us about what they want to get from a program. They tend to focus on what's the content, but our most interesting learning has been around the space of stopping and thinking and the value that this in itself can provide for people. I'm joined by my business partner, Neil Kimberley, and he heads up the design and delivery of our programmes. So Neil's got a really interesting background. His background is in both education and he's also qualified to master's level as a coach. And so a lot of his experience and research relates to the space and place that we ask people to learn in and the impact that this can have on their ability to reflect. And finally, we've been joined by Cara McCarthy, who is Head of Organisational Development at M&G. Cara has been really instrumental in some of the work that we've done at M&G and has recently joined us on a coaching retreat in Morocco. Prior to her role as Head of Organisational Development, Cara was Head of Leadership and Talent Development, also at M&G, sorry, Learning and Talent Development, also at M&G. And she's really kindly offered to bring her perspective about the value of reflection in a larger organisation and will hopefully be able to share some of the successes and pitfalls that she's experienced in her role. So before we move on to sort of starting to get into the content of the webinar, I just wanted to say hi to Cara. Thank you for coming. I'm just really interested in why this topic is important to you and what interests you about it in terms of your role at M&G.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, for me, it's absolutely crucial. As an organisation development practitioner working within the reality, the very fast-changing and busy-paced reality of organisational life, I'm really conscious that the quality of our thinking often depends on our ability to stop, to not just take that next active step. So for me, looking at M&G and thinking about my own experience as a leader in the organisation, I'm conscious that survival mentality is often what's driving our thinking, our acting, our doing. And that can be as a result of really positive things like growth, global distribution channels or product development or fund inflows, keeping us very busy, very active as an organization. But also it can be down to some really difficult and challenging things such as regulatory responses and tsunami of change that comes from disruptive technology affecting our industry, and I'm sure many others on the call. So for me, it's very, very important that we are making decisions, that we're innovating, that we're problem solving based on really good reflection. And I don't see that happening enough because of the survival mentality that seems to be driving a lot of what we're all having to do on a day-to-day basis.
Brilliant, thanks, Cara. I think from our point of view, it's great that you joined us today because you will be able to bring that perspective of being part of a sort of 2,000 strong organisation and kind of some of the challenges that exist in that sort of environment. And so we're going to be asking you to comment as we go through about some of the different things that we're talking about and options that we're considering. So in terms of what we're going to be covering today then, an important place to start is why this is an important topic. So it sounds simple and straightforward, it's just about stopping and thinking more, but in reality it's far from simple. So what value does it deliver and why is it important both to businesses and to individuals? And then moving on from there, we need to consider what gets in the way of people being more reflective, because quite a lot of things do get in the way of that. So what stops them from pressing the proverbial pause button? And do businesses even value it, or crucially, do they understand the value of it? We're then going to pull together some of our experience and research to share with you some of the ways that you can build reflection into the culture of an organisation. So that's going to be a combination of some practical tips as well as some of the neuroscience and thinking behind different approaches. And we'll then finish by asking you to look at your own learning cultures and whether these could support greater reflection, along with some tips for making these changes if needed. So there is an opportunity for you to ask questions as we go through. You'll see that there's an area on your screen which allows you to submit a question. We'll be monitoring those questions as they come in. By and large, we'll leave the questions to the end because we might want to just make sure we haven't covered the answer to those questions in the content of the webinar. But we will make sure at the end that we review the questions that have come in and make sure that we answer those before we finish. So I'm now going to hand over to Neil. He's going to talk a little bit about why this topic is so important. Neil.
Thanks, Ruth, and morning, everyone. So I think interesting for us is why is this topic so important? And I think why it's become an interesting area of investigation for us is that increasingly we're being challenged by our clients to, create development programs for their senior teams and senior leaders, because they're looking for leaders that they increasingly want them to be, more agile, more resilient, more behaviourally flexible, more creative, more innovative, and that no longer is there sort of technical competence and experience enough, and they're driving for more and more from their people. However, I think the challenge for the delegates that we often get through on these programs is that we're very increasingly aware that they're working in an ever-changing, uncertain marketplace economy. They've got these now permanently connected sort of 24/7 lives through smartphones and the need for sort of urgent response to everything. Yet somehow we just expect them to adopt these new behaviours. Yet often either their own organisational environment doesn't necessarily encourage that approach, or the client is looking for more content to be built in because that's deemed to be where the value add is. But as Ruth mentioned before, I think increasingly our experience over the last 2 or 3 years has been where we can specifically design in time and space into a program that allows leaders the time and space to think. So if we want leaders to develop creativity, innovation, we need to enable them to have that time to learn and embed those new habits as part of a program. And so they need the time and space to do that. And, unfortunately, in our experience, and I'm sure for a lot of you listening, you can't just unlearn 20 years worth of habits in a one-day workshop crammed full of new content around what it takes to be agile and resilient. You've got to give them the space and time to think about that. And then sort of linked to that then is, what we often see then in the organisations when we're doing the sort of needs analysis around senior leadership development is that often there's an organisational culture and a general learning environment in the organisation which is just far too fast paced, and as Cara pointed out before, there are some very positive outputs to that, but some of the downsides is that some of those senior leaders just simply don't have the space to stop and think, and really all they're managing to do is to cope with the workload they've got and are running from one thing to the next without that space to reflect on what their impact and influence is in the direction they want to take their area of the business. So I suppose one of the things we're sort of looking at and wondering about today is why don't organisations value the notion of time for reflection for their leaders? And so one of the things that often gets pushed back on us is that there's a big perception that it's too soft and fluffy, and how can that really give leaders a genuine commercial advantage at this level? Surely we need to be focusing on strategy and things like that. And often the reasons that are cited back to us for not spending time on reflecting, either from organisations or from the leaders themselves, is that we're just simply too busy. We don't have the time to do that. It's indulgent. To stop and think about myself. Everything else is too urgent and important. It feels like I'm wasting time. I might be negatively judged about what I'm doing. You know, or simply that they don't feel that that's, you know, for what they're paid to do, that stop that getting stuck into the day to day. So I guess that would be a good place to stop, Cara, and sort of ask you from your perspective, either personal experience or experience of working with developing the senior leaders within M&G, how that sort of resonates with you.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Absolutely. I think it's very clear to me on a day-to-day basis just how much stress our people, our senior leaders, our managers, in fact, everyone is actually under. Organizations are really being pressurized from every single angle and every single level to keep delivering more with less time and often with less resource. And even if you have a very positive organizational environment, which I really do believe and experience for myself at M&G is the case, nonetheless, what we do see are people trying to achieve an enormous amount with very limited personal and organizational resources. And so I think it's absolutely crucial that we find ways to give people the chance to take that step back, to reflect, to pause. And that may be through programmatic initiatives where we invite leaders to take some time to think together. But it can also be through our company policies around giving people the chance to spend a day where they're not having to commute into the office and they can manage their diaries differently, create the space that they need for thinking, for reflecting, for making sense, for planning, for organizing in a way that's more personal to them. So I think it's crucial. And I think it's very much something that's only going to become increasingly integral to how we make our organizations good places to be for people.
Definitely. Great. There's some really useful insights there, Cara. Thank you. I think at this point, Ruth, I'm going to hand back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I think what's really interesting, a couple of things that I've picked up on that Cara has said so far today. She mentioned the survival mentality towards the start and also keep on delivering more. And I think one of the things that we find in a corporate setting is that in the short to medium term, people can operate really well without taking the time to pause and reflect. They sort of almost become the superheroes, so they're taking more and more on, striving, fighting, winning, overcoming at all costs. And this is known as drive behaviour, and it's something we're going to come on to talk about in a greater depth and a bit later on. But essentially, our drive brain or motivator releases dopamine, which is a potentially addictive chemical in our brain that stimulates feelings of drive and excitement, or a sense of hyped up sense of pleasure or urgency. So dopamine as a chemical is linked to us wanting things quickly and now, so it inhibits our ability to defer pleasure for longer term success or reward. And it's quite similar in its chemical makeup to drugs like speed. And so it is addictive. For businesses in the short term, this is great because they're getting highly motivated and productive employees who are delivering great business results. But why would they want anything to change? So if they don't know how much more people can deliver when they do pause and reflect and think, there's no real reason for them to encourage it. And the old adage often comes into play, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. However, as Neil's just explained, this eventually isn't sustainable because people aren't able to function in this high speed, win at all costs, keep delivering more environment. And they start to suffer with stress, anxiety, burnout. And crucially, they stop being able to think creatively and can only be reactive. And if we go back to your starting point, Neil, around why do organisations want this? Well, actually, they want their employees to be more agile and behaviourally flexible and creative. But they can't do that when they're suffering from that kind of stress. So we thought it might be interesting actually just to kind of ask those of you who've joined us today about what gets in the way of people reflecting in your business. And you can see on your screen here that there's a poll that you can select answers from. So there are a number of options there that we've pulled together based upon our experience around company culture. You know, is it the culture that stops people from doing this? Or is it that people don't have time, that they're too busy? Perhaps they've got more urgent things to focus on, that kind of priority of the urgent and important, which means that those things that are important but not yet urgent kind of gets pushed down the list. Or is there a perception of reflection as being kind of slow and ponderous, and actually if you're really good, you don't need the time to do it? Or perhaps it's something else. So if you could choose what you think is the most relevant answer to you, and then you just need to submit send vote at the bottom of your screen, you'll then get a thank you for your participation and a vote. So we're just waiting for those answers to come in, and I'm going to then get those results put up on the screen Emma, if we could pop those up on the screen now. Let's have a look at what we've got. We're just waiting for a final few people to submit their answers. Okay, so in terms of what we're seeing here, quite an even spread actually. So people don't have time or they're too busy. It seems to be the most, or the biggest reason for people not being able to stop and reflect in business, and then more urgent things to focus on. And so we often find this actually with the clients that we work with, that there tends to be an urgent, busy culture that exists, which really stops people from feeling that they can stop and reflect, because there's almost a sense of panic that if they stop and reflect, things aren't getting done and it slows things down. So it's really interesting that that's the kind of theme that's coming out from what you guys are experiencing as well. So if we move on then, let's start to consider some options for developing greater reflection. So this is going to be a combination of research and thinking about how the brain works. So kind of setting up the context of why the brain needs to be in a certain state to be able to reflect effectively, plus then some practical things that you could consider starting to do. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to a model that's been developed by one of our senior associates, Dr. Nilisha Wickramasinghe. Her research has been focused on the role of perfectionism and the inner critic, and how we can bring a sense of greater compassion to our everyday thinking and being. It's really interesting work, very in-depth and quite challenging. So if you are interested in finding out more about that, then please do look at her doctorate. But essentially, building on the work of the evolution of the brain, she's gone on to look at the different motivating systems that exist in the brain, each of which is developed as part of the brain's evolution. So as we know, emotions and the responses that arise from them evolve because they serve various functions. So in essence, our emotions motivate us. And in this diagram, you can see that she's identified what she's called 3 basic motivating systems, which are related to that evolution and growth of our brain capability. So our earliest emotions were designed to alert us to danger so that we could survive and ultimately go on to reproduce. And this is called the threat brain. And that corresponds to the part of the brain that's responsible for our fight, flight or freeze response when we're in danger. As we then evolved into mammals and realised that protecting our young increased our chances of survival, we developed emotions that motivated us to bond and care in more intimate ways. And that's represented by the blue area on the right, or the safe brain. And then later, as we began to live in more complex groups, our brain then developed what we're calling drive-based emotions, which were about motivating us to compete and to raise our status and to accumulate resources. So we've got these 3 essential motivating systems going on in our brain. So why is this important within the context of pressing the pause button and reflecting? Well, what we know is that when people are operating in threat brain, that red part of the diagram, they aren't able to think clearly, so they can't reason or reflect or discuss or make decisions. And that's because they're being driven by that primitive flight, fight or freeze instinct. So essentially the chemical cortisol floods our body and shuts down the neocortex, or the thinking part of our brain. And Nilisha's work shows that sometimes people respond to this threat at work in particular by then moving into drive brain. So that's the area of our brain which is about striving and ambition and winning. So as we've discussed, in the short term, that can deliver some great results. And sadly, companies often rely on this image of their leaders as being superheroes. But in the longer term, drive behaviours which are motivated from this place of threat become toxic and lead to stress and anxiety and burnout. And threat doesn't have to actually be a threat to someone's physical safety. Our brains will interpret threat as danger in lots of different ways. So, you know, the pressure of difficult conversations or deadlines or things going wrong can all generate that threat brain response. The drive part of the brain is also associated with doing, not really thinking and reflecting. So actually it's the safe brain that needs some focus in order to help people start to reflect more effectively. So the safe brain motivator is associated with really deep thinking, learning, reflecting, connection. And it's when people are in their safe brain that they can do their best creative thinking and they can build resilience. So if people's drive brain is then switched on or motivated from that place of safe brain, they're then able to display sustainable and positive drive behaviours that are about longer term performance and excitement about what they're doing and real engagement. So if we do want people to reflect more so that they can become more agile and creative and resilient, we need to help them access their safe brains. And we're just going to spend a bit of time thinking about how is that achievable, both at an individual level, but then also at an organisational level. So the slide in front of you, you can see there around accessing Safe Brain. There are 5 key points that I just want to talk through. The first one is around self-awareness and really paying careful attention to the internal physiological signals that are going on inside us. So these subtle clues are monitored by something called the insula, and attention is given to any part of the body. Attention that's given to any part of the body really amps up our sensitivity to that part. So if you tune into your heartbeat, the insula activates more neurons in the circuitry. But what's interesting, I think, is how well people can sense their heartbeats has become a standard way of measuring self-awareness. So essentially, if we're paying more attention to these signals in our body, we're going to become better at reading them and acting on them appropriately, rather than just kind of carrying on regardless. The next point there is then around good cognitive control. People who have got good cognitive control tend to be those who sort of stay calm in a crisis and are able to sort of tame their own agitation and recover from defeat. And what's great to see is that there's a social and emotional learning method that's being used with school children now to help them develop this cognitive control, which is known as the traffic light approach. So when they're confronted with an upsetting problem, the children are asked to think of a traffic signal. So red light means stop, calm down, think before you act. The amber light means slow down and think of several possible solutions. And the green light might mean try out a plan and see how it works. And thinking in these terms allows children to move away from that amygdala-driven response to the prefrontal-driven deliberate behaviour. Mindsight then is some work developed by a guy called Daniel Siegel, and it's all about helping us to be aware of our mental processes without being swept away by them. So in a sense, it enables us to get ourselves off the autopilot of ingrained behaviours and habitual responses, and sort of moves beyond the reactive loops that we all have a tendency to get trapped in. So essentially, it's letting us name and tame the emotions that we're experiencing rather than being overwhelmed by them. Essentially, if we can identify the feeling and accept it in the present moment and then let go of it or transform it, that really helps us. So if you think back to that threat drive behaviour loop that we talked about, if we're consumed by a feeling of fear or anger or sadness, we might get stuck in that loop. But if we can identify it and accept it, we can then let it go and then move back towards that calm and connected place of Safe Brain where we're able to do much more effective reflection and thinking. Mindfulness then is on there, mindfulness and reflection, and really this is about the meditation of old, and it's a way of connecting with ourselves and directing our attention so that we notice what we're feeling and how we're experiencing something without judgment. Different people have different views on meditation, but actually there are some really simple, effective meditative practices that people can use very quickly when they're at work, just sort of deep breathing techniques, for example, which can help them to come back from a place of feeling threat brain and into safety, where they're then able to think more clearly and effectively. And it's something that we sometimes do with individuals where they're interested in that as an approach. And it's a practice. It's not something that can sort of work just as a one-off. People need to be willing to work on it and do it regularly, but it can be a great way of re-engaging that safe brain. And then finally, relationships. We've evolved so that we're motivated to stay connected, and the impact of isolation can be really significant. So in moments of distress and threat, recognising that we're connected and part of the human condition, if you like, can help people to really regain access to their safe brain. So from all of these things, though, I think the place to start, and perhaps the most effective way of accessing safe brain, is through being kind to ourselves. And what I've described here are some of the neuroscience that supports our need to be reflective, and I've described some of the ways in which people can access or connect with their safe brain. Before I move on then and talk about how can we create this type of environment at work, Cara, is there anything that you wanted to sort of say or reflect upon in terms of that information that I've shared?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I find what you've described as being, on the one hand, just absolutely intuitive in terms of, we know that for all of us, and certainly for the people who are leading our organizations, the ability to be aware of their own thoughts, their own patterns, to anticipate how those might impact their decision making and also their leadership, and what their patterns are around how they connect into the wisdom, the collective wisdom of the people around them, it is so crucial. And what I find has probably been most effective at M&G, and certainly just one of the things that I think has great potential for us, it's just the value of those coaching relationships. So what you've said has reminded me of the value, really, of the investment that we make in coaching, because I think it really allows our leaders not only to become aware of their own thoughts, their own patterns, to pause and reflect on their own processes, but to begin to recognize the wisdom around them that they may need to more effectively tap into. And I think one of the fight, flight, freeze activities that leaders can engage in is becoming entrenched in feeling that the responsibility is on their shoulders alone to make a decision or to make something happen. When in fact there's clearly a community of people around them who are all equally capable of helping to lead the organization through decision making, through problem solving, etc., that they can tap into and draw from. And that can be very difficult for leaders to do. So I just, as you were describing that, it was connecting me into the value of the coaching relationship in the organization.
Brilliant. That's really interesting, and we're going to come on to talk about coaching actually. So it may be that you could say a little bit more about that at that point as well. I think what's really stood out for me then as well about what you've just said is that connecting into the collective wisdom of the people around them, and that's one of the greatest challenges I think in an organisation. And one of the things that we really champion is how organisations can create time to think. So it's something that we now pay very close attention to in our program design. So whether you're considering this in the context of designing training or an everyday approach to conversations and meetings and project planning, how creating that environment that's conducive to reflection and pressing the pause button is crucial. And I think it just ties in really nicely with what you've just said there about responsibility not just sitting on an individual's shoulders alone, and how they can find those ways to tap into the collective wisdom of the people around them. And I think this is one of those ways. So what do I mean by time to think, though? Some of you may be familiar with Nancy Klein's work, and some of our thinking and approach builds on this. If you've not read her books, I'd really recommend that you do. However, we're thinking about this topic in a broader sense and how you can take this approach and embed it into a culture of an organisation. So I've identified 3 key things that we really like to pay attention to in terms of creating time to think. And you might want to think about this in terms of your organisation and whether these qualities exist in your organisation. So the first one is around ease. So if you can create an easeful culture or approach to discussion, so one where people don't feel rushed to come up with an answer or to make a point, they're then able to slow their thinking down. And this creates opportunities for more creative and expansive thinking. And from this, absolutely comes greater agility. Because if we refer back to the neuroscience stuff that I've just been talking about, no one comes up with great answers or ideas when they're under pressure, because essentially they're in threat brain. So if you need your leaders to be more agile and resilient, taking the pressure out of conversations will allow them to do this. And it might sound counterintuitive, but it really speeds things up, because conversations happen once rather than multiple times, and because things have really been properly thought through and not rushed. And that's that kind of creating that collective wisdom that comes from those easeful conversations where it isn't competitive and combative. It's very much respectful and giving that space and time for people to think. The second point then is around attention. So giving focused attention to the person who is thinking or speaking or reflective. So it's about quality of listening and removing a culture of interruption and one-upmanship. So by paying attention to what people are saying and allowing them to finish, we create clarity. And from this place, good decisions can be made and people can start to make conscious choices rather than reacting to a situation that they're in. And then finally, equality. So this means a number of things to us, but first of all, it's about recognising that everyone's equal and that everyone's opinions and thinking have equal value and validity. And I think often there's a pressure in organisations, and Kara's just said this herself, that senior leaders, the responsibility sort of rests on their shoulders. So they need to be the ideas generators, they need to solve the problems. Or in other organisations, perhaps there's a culture where people won't challenge senior leaders. So if you can create a space where everyone can speak equally and openly, this in turn generates that free thinking and creativity and collaboration, actually, where suddenly the ideas are coming from the collective rather than sitting with one person. And I think this is about exploring whether your business culture values reflection and what it can deliver. So is reflection seen as a positive choice, or is it seen as something that slows things down? And I think it very much comes from the top. So if leaders are modelling quality thinking, reflecting, they're tacitly giving permission for others to do the same. But if what they're demonstrating is kind of interrupting, I'm right, one-upmanship type of behaviours, or indeed if they're shouldering the responsibility without seeking support and sharing from others or tapping into the collective wisdom of the organisation, then it becomes very difficult for other people to start to do those things. Cara mentioned coaching, and I'm now going to pass over to Neil to talk a little bit about coaching as one option for helping leaders to reflect. So Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. And before I do, I think just leading on from what you just said, I think one of the things that's been really interesting for us to notice by building time to think into the design of our programs is that it helps leaders realize that it's a bit of a cliche, but sort of slowing down to speed up, and that by being more inclusive in their thinking, and that you talked about the equality there, and people feeling willing to and able to contribute and challenge, that actually it's a way of them finding more space and time themselves, because they can delegate more, they can give more autonomy and ownership to their teams. And so one way of helping them explore that is through one-to-one coaching. And I think where this works best in organizations is those organizations that use coaching at a senior level as a developmental tool rather than a remedial action for something that needs fixing. So, in a way, it's a deliberate way of the organization saying to an individual leader, we value you and you matter, and we're giving you this time to stop, and we're giving you the permission to stop and think about yourself. And I think for a lot of senior leaders that's quite a big step to take, because I think often their perception of coaching, if they've never had it, is, I haven't got time to stop and do navel gazing. This is all very self-indulgent. I've got a business to run. Yet actually, if people who've been through it and have allowed themselves that time and space for one-to-one coaching, really see that it's a space where they are protected and they can stop and reflect in a non-judgmental, unbiased environment, and often they don't find that anywhere else, and it allows them to sort of genuinely dissociate themselves from the workplace. So whatever the deep thinking they need to do, whether that's about agility or creativity or innovation, by removing themselves from that environment, it helps them to think in a different way. And it's interesting as well that there's lots of research out there now around the role of the natural environment, and Ruth touched on that at the intro about some of my work around how, what I find unfortunate in a lot of, especially as executive and senior coaching, is there's not much thought given to the space and place where the coaching takes place. Yet actually it has a significant influence on the quality of the attention and focus, not only of the coachee, but also of the coach themselves. And then finally, is that actually, can we be much more innovative and creative in the style and the manner in which coaching takes place? So I've sort of this walking and talking there on the screen, and again, there's some really interesting research been done from a neuroscience perspective to say that we do some of our best cognitive processing when we're somewhere around 65% of our maximum heart rate. When we're sitting down for large periods of time, and often how most coaching is delivered, is that sense of being inactive isn't necessarily leading to some of the best thinking. So if you can help people dissociate from their workplace, if you can, where possible, I know it's not always possible practically and logistically, using natural or inspiring environments, and then try walking and coaching at the same time, it can lead to quite a different dynamic in the coaching relationship. And I'm going to stop there and bring Cara back in, because as Ruth mentioned in the intro, about a month ago we did our annual leaders sort of coaching retreat in Morocco, in trekking through the Atlas Mountains, and Cara was one of our 6 delegates on that. And I'd just be interested, given what I've just said, Cara, what your experience of that experience in Morocco was like.
Thanks, Neil. So the walking and talking approach is surprisingly and deceptively powerful in my experience. Clearly, being in a place like Morocco, where you are surrounded by awe-inspiring scenery, and something completely different from your average day-to-day experience, in my case as a Londoner, in itself just stimulates very different thinking and a different pace. There is something, I think, about um, how walking enables you to reconnect with things like being aware of your heartbeat, being aware of your breathing, being conscious of your footfall. So there's something mindful in the very experience of walking. And then when you connect a conversation into that, somehow it has surprising benefits. So for me personally, the opportunity to spend 4 or 5 days walking through the mountains and not necessarily having coaching conversations for a great deal of that time, but at key moments having a conversation that suddenly clicked into something that felt genuinely beneficial, because it was allowing me to connect of thinking that was suddenly relevant in that moment and related to something that I was facing in the workplace or in my professional decision making. So for me, it was enormously beneficial. And actually, it underscores in my mind why the element of walks and talks on our leadership development programs that we run at M&G are so successful. So even though, again, they might not be in a Moroccan environment, which is very different, but even having a leadership development program set in an environment where people can take 10, 15 minutes in pairs or trios, to go for a walk through the forest or through the field, or to walk around a pond and have a conversation, we get such phenomenal feedback from people as to what actually happens in those 10, 15, 20 minutes as they walk and talk together. So I can really connect that back. It doesn't always have to be Morocco. It doesn't have to be 4 or 5 days, and it doesn't have to be in a totally awe-inspiring environment. It could even be a walk and talk along the Thames, across the way from your office, because that's a sufficiently different environment from our office space, I think, to stimulate some of that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. And I think that sort of last point you made, I think, I know that the Morocco was I suppose, the sort of the extreme in terms of inspirational environment, but I think what you said at the end there about it's so easy to build it in to local programs, whether they're development programs or one-to-one coaching as well. And it's just, I think often it's just a case of putting that challenge into the design and saying, well, just because we've always done it in this room, is there a different way of doing it? And certainly on the one-to-one coaching as well, in my own experience, where I've put that offer and challenge to clients to, well, let's go and try, how do you fancy trying something different? As you said, it doesn't have to be 4 to 5 days, and it doesn't have to be as inspirational an environment, and it still has a big impact. So just in this week alone, I've had one leader who also wanted to do more intensive coaching. So in the end, we ended up coaching for about 6 hours, which we would never have managed to do sat in his office or a meeting room in his workplace. Yet by him being willing to give the time up and go away from the office and walk, we were able to sustain that coaching for that period of time, and he got much further progress on the issue than he would have done if we just spent 90 minutes in his office. And as you said, it can just be down a towpath. I mean, thankfully for me today, after the webinar, I'm off to coach one of my clients, and we're going to be walking down the canal towpath near her office. So I think that your point there is that we just need to be a bit more creative and innovative about how we can use the walk and talk approach, whether that's in development programs or in one-to-one coaching. And just moving on from that then, one of the things we've mentioned this in the article that supported the webinar today. So I just wanted to say a little piece on it, and we have done other webinars on it in much more detail if you wanted to go and look at it. But we've talked about the role of the natural environment, and there is a huge body of research now about why that's important and how it can really help that sense of pressing the pause button and creating space and time for reflection. And it comes from this theory of attention restoration theory, which we reference the work of Stephen Kaplan. And what it talks about is there are two main types of attention. There's directed and involuntary. And unfortunately, the modern work environment is very much attuned to a sort of directed attention. So, the work environment leaves people, they're bombarded with, many, many stimuli that require really high levels of directed attention, where they really having to focus all of their sort of cognitive energy on the thing that they need to focus on. And in this, unfortunately, leads to significantly depleted levels of mental energy. So whether that's, high noise levels and lack of privacy from open plan spaces that really means people have to really focus, or long periods of time focusing on documents on screens, or those days where they have sort of a series of back-to-back meetings that take lots of real cognitive focus, and just that permanent online connection of smartphones with constant updates and expectations of immediate response times. Whereas where you can encourage people either through programs or just in their lunch times or before or after work, or as I've just mentioned, in one-to-one coaching, if we can encourage people into a natural environment, on the other hand, that can really help replenish those cognitive energy levels and enables that deeper thought process. So the difference in a natural setting is the requirement for directed attention is significantly minimized, and it's much more of this involuntary attention, which is essentially how is the environment in which we evolved. And it's going back to sort of the threat and safe brain that Ruth talked about earlier. Unfortunately, we're living in a completely different environment, but our software hasn't really updated in the brain. So where we can help people to reconnect in a natural environment to do some of that thinking can really help. So the logic, therefore, is that after an interaction with a natural environment, people are much more able to perform, then go back to performing tasks that depend on that very focused, directed attention, and their abilities there, and that cognitive control that Ruth mentioned before is significantly improved. And generally, the built urban environment doesn't lend itself to that, because there's lots of things that lend themselves to capturing attention dramatically, and therefore additionally require that directed attention. So it was just sort of drawing your focus to this as an area of research that you might want to go back and look at, and how you can design that into your either one-to-one coaching, development programs, or encouraging people to reconnect with natural environments if they're in those sort of that stressful and toxic drive threat loop that Ruth talked about earlier. So I'm just going to leave that there, and then we're going to go into another poll. So Emma, if you could sort of launch that for us. This is a very closed question, I know, but we just thought it would just be interesting to sort of push people to one side of the fence or the other in their thinking. So if you think about your own current organisations or organisations you work in, does the learning culture there support the opportunity for a more reflective approach? So I'd just be interested if you could put your thoughts down and submit your votes. And we'll just wait for some more of those to come through. I think that's nearly everybody. So just select one and submit your vote. Okay, I think we'll go with that. Thanks, Emma. Oh, interesting. Okay, that was a broader spread than I was expecting, actually. Cara, how does that compare to your experience in M&G, the learning culture, and how that supports reflective approach?
It's interesting. When I think about learning culture at M&G, I feel we absolutely have room for growth there, and at the same time, I'm conscious that we are actually a very slow decision-making organisation, which is a bit of a tension really between wanting to do things right and therefore taking quite an extended amount of time and in a very consensus-based approach, which has its pros and certainly has its cons, seeking to really understand an issue in depth. So in that sense, I think that we've got a strong process by which we come to a place of feeling that we're making the right decisions for the right reasons. However, does that necessarily mean that we are a learning organisation? And I don't think it does mean that. So learning organisation for me, and in terms of how we would set up the reflection process for that, would then include those check back points. Whereas as an organisation, our teams, our leaders, etc., would promote and actively prioritise the opportunities to really say, did our decision making serve us well, and did it result in what we thought it would, and could we have done that better? So I put yes. as in we could do more to support a more reflective approach. And that's because I think that piece is missing, that active looking back, learning and reflecting and asking ourselves the question, did our decision-making process support us well? Did it serve us well?
I think that's a really interesting observation, and it sort of leads into the next slide we're going to talk about, which is, for those people that have said no, or to some extent, is to how you can move on. I guess sort of identify what is your current sort of learning climate, and what can you do that would help support a better approach to creating the time to stop and pause and reflect. And again, this is a diagram we've used before talking about adult learning environments, but I guess I've highlighted 4 things there that I think, within an organisation you could look at to assess what the genuine current status quo is for the learning climate. So I think the sort of, from the L&D policy perspective, I guess what I'm thinking about there is, is there that encouragement and notion of leaders needing time and space to develop the behavioural flexibility that the business demands, and therefore whether it's development programs, coaching, those feedback loops that you just mentioned, Cara, are they genuinely there that allow leaders to sort of see that it's acceptable as an approach, and wouldn't be frowned on. So I think that's one thing. I think the management philosophy can have an influence as well. So, if it's an organisation where things develop, much more organically, with sort of, as it has more of a humanistic approach to its management philosophy, then I think that generally, lends itself to creating a learning environment that's much more supportive to this approach, where each individual at all levels, not just senior levels, genuinely own their own learning and have that autonomy to take time and space to learn and think and reflect. I think the organisational structure as well, I think, not in all organisations, but our experience has always often been as well that, in very hierarchical organisations, often we've talked about the hero leader before, and often, if the culture within a team or a department or the whole organisation doesn't support that, the leader to be able to, delegate autonomy and responsibility and enable, their teams to take ownership of problems and decision making, it's quite hard then for the leader ever to find space where they're not constantly involved in the day-to-day firefighting and crisis response, and never really get that space. So I think the organisational structure can influence that significantly. And I think the final one, I think we touched on this throughout as well, is right at the top of the organisation. Does that senior team at the top, whether that's the exec or the management team, to what extent do they model those behaviours themselves? So if senior leaders and middle managers and frontline leaders below them don't ever see them taking the time to stop and pause and think, then they're never, in our experience, they're never likely to feel comfortable doing that themselves. So one thing around the learning climate can be starting at the top of the organisation, because it's generally a smaller number of people, and looking at, well, what would we need to do to encourage them or create the opportunity for them to take more time to stop and, press the pause button, as we've said several times before. And I guess several of those tie back to what Cara was just mentioning before as her experience at M&G. So to sort of start to round off then, so if this was something that you wanted to either build in, so if you're an external consultant, designing development programs at senior levels for organisations, or you're at L&D or OD leader within your own business, what are some of the first steps that you can do to help develop this space for reflection? So I think that in that paying more attention to the existing culture, if the climate for learning at that holistic level is not right, then that has to be the first problem to tackle in the first instance. And I guess we've just talked about some of the places you might start to measure what the status quo is. And I think, in our experience, looking at, does that executive team genuinely value the notion of leaders needing time to stop and reflect? If they, so if the outcomes that they genuinely want for their leaders are the agility, resilience, creativity, innovation, behavioural flexibility, all those things we've mentioned, then they've got to also acknowledge that they have to invest in creating the time and space to allow them to do that. I think that's really important to sort of assess the appetite for that in the organisation at a senior level. I think on that, assessing the levels of acknowledgement, do they genuinely believe that it would give their leaders commercial advantage? Because I think if they don't, and they're just ticking a box, and actually in their core they think it's a bit too pink and fluffy, and it is wasting time, and is a lazy approach to leadership, then I think you've got some real educating to do first before you commit time and budget to try and working on that. I think there's this thing I've talked about, to what extent can leaders give that delegated authority, and does the structure and the hierarchy allow for that? And then finally, that, accepting that, at this senior level, that simply building more knowledge and content into development programs isn't the answer. And that most of them, in our experience, that actually once you can convince them that, like, this isn't an academic process, we need you to genuinely connect and think more deeply about what you're doing and your impact and influence. By the end of a program with that as the style of delivery, they absolutely get it. And this whole notion of slowing down to speed up, and they find that they're even more productive when they take the time to stop and think about what they're doing and where they're going. From your perspective, Cara, are there any things either about those 4 points that I've mentioned there, or in addition that you've tried before that have helped to encourage this, start to build it into the culture of the organisation?
Well, I think one of the key things that I try and encourage senior leadership teams to do at M&G is, when they are trying to lead some form of a change, which is very much part of our story at present, is take that time out as a group to really align themselves around a common understanding of what it is that they are trying to achieve. And that's, as we would all know, I think on this call, much harder said than done.
Yeah.
So creating alignment, I think, is actually a very reflective process in itself, because you're asking people to give up time, be honest, surface their concerns, and surface their very honest viewpoints about what they are trying to achieve together. And that is it needs inherently to be a very reflective process. And what I found is that initially, when I say this is going to be crucial to your ability as a group to lead your part of the organization, or the organization as a whole, through the next months and years of change, there is a resistance to taking that time out to do it. So they're thinking very mechanistically and very linearly about what they're trying to achieve. But the reaction, once they've spent that time together, is always completely diametrically opposite. And so they are surprised at how powerful taking time out to reflect together as a collective has been on their ability to lead and align well together. So that would be one of the ways that I see creating space for reflection in the day-to-day reality of the organization has been effective. Apart from coaching, which I fully believe in and we invest in quite intensively, I'd say that those two things have been particularly relevant for us in the particular part of the life cycle that we're in at M&G.
That's really interesting. It leads into, I'm conscious of time, so we said that we'd come back to any questions that people have posed. And I guess I'll pass back to both Ruth and Cara here to sort of ask them the question. Someone's asked, how difficult is it to try and embed this culture of reflection where people are not seeing that modelled at the top of the organisation? I'd be interested in both of your perspectives and the experience of that.
Okay, so just to pick up on that point around when it's not modelled at the senior level in an organisation, I think what we've learned, Neil, from the work we've done with our clients, has been around that educating piece, really, which, picking up on one of your last points, that we often get comments from delegates who are going through a leadership development experience with us about the fact that this is all well and good, but actually we're not seeing this at the top, so we can't possibly do it. And so part of our role as an external partner supporting an HR or a learning and development function is how can we really help to educate people at that senior level. And often it requires them to take a leap of faith and come and spend some time with us, working with us, because it's not one of those things where you can kind of do a shortened, hey, let's do 2 hours in the boardroom and update you on what we're doing, because that it requires that in-depth experience from them as well. So there has to be some really strong influencing done by L&D or HR to persuade them that actually they need to come and invest some time themselves, and through that we can then start to really introduce some of those reflective tools and help them to see the value of those practices, if you like, in the business. And I think this links to another question that's come in actually around how can you demonstrate return on investment. So Cara, I don't know if you've got any thoughts around that, either influencing the senior teams where there is resistance, or how you can demonstrate the return on investment for a more reflective approach.
I think I'll pick up on the question around, in effect, what I think what's really being asked is at what point will individuals or teams see the benefit and the need for reflection? Because often, as some of the kind of moderated questions I can see on the screen say, they actually may be opposed to it, unwilling to be honest, or even not value reflective time because of a professional services type arrangement. Something that stands out for me is our fund managers. So although I don't work in a professional services environment, our fund managers are clearly producing value by the time that they're spent in making decisions about stocks and portfolio allocation, etc. So any time spent not doing that would be seen as wasted time for them or the wrong priority. And a very clear example of that for me, that they needed a burning platform, a particular group of them, in order to stop doing that and focus on having a conversation with a broader range of people. And when that burning platform became visible to them, i.e., why is it that our products are not being received well by certain parts of the market when we think they are absolutely correct and right solutions, that burning platform was the influencing factor that allowed them to stop, move away from the computer, so to speak, and spend some time in a dialogue. So we used a fishbowl approach, which helped them understand from our key distribution people feedback from the marketplace that they had not been willing to hear until that point. So I don't know if that's a helpful, very mini example, but what I took from that and what I learned from that was that often you need those individuals to realize that their current strategies, no matter how correct they think they are somehow not working, and that's going to require a different willingness to hear new feedback. And then, of course, creating a framework or a forum by which that can be possible for them to hear was very useful in that case for me.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting and important point that you've made there, Cara. And I think something that we often do in terms of creating that burning platform, if you like, is around the sort of the behavioural feedback for some people. So some of our programs start off with some form of 360, because often people feel as though there's not a problem. The way I'm doing it is fine and right. But actually, if you can present them with some data or some evidence that perhaps they could do things differently, that can really help to create a motivator or a motivating force, if you like, for people starting to say, okay, there may be a different way. And I think going back to the question that's been posed here about where people explain away awkward feedback and how can we get people into a position where they want to hear feedback, I think this then refers back to that safe psychological space, Neil, where actually if you can create an environment where people feel safe to be open and vulnerable, then actually they're much more likely to be willing to hear feedback than if it's presented in a threatening way or in a combative way, where actually what happens is people go into threat brain and start to shut down or explain it away. Neil, anything you wanted to add at all?
No, just sort of picking up on, again, so in the quote Cara alluded to, the question about in professional services and where time is being, people are rewarded by the time recorded for client work, and how does that sit with time for reflection? And I think it ties into take Cara's point about the burning platform, and I think it's a really it's one that we come up with against a lot in the professional services, and I can, we see how difficult an issue that is culturally, and I think that's where then, as either OD or LND, either internal or external people, have really got to increasingly challenge at a senior level to say, if these are the people that you need to drive the growth of the business, then your senior leaders especially need more time to do that. And whilst they are valued and rewarded for their recorded time on client work, that actually how sustainable will that be in a world where, you know, there are a lot more sort of disruptive models coming into the marketplace in all industries, not just in professional services, and actually encouraging them to think, well, so the old model, how long will the old model work? And I think there are some, you know, there's certainly one of the clients that came with us to Morocco was from a professional services background and works in OD, and I know that was one of her particular areas of interest, of convincing, you know, the partners to look at how they can give their, especially the very senior leaders, senior partners, some time to reflect and think about the future of the business and the top talent that's coming through.
I'm conscious that we are now up to our hour, so I just wanted to draw things to a close really, and finish off by saying a big thank you to Cara for joining us today. Cara, is there anything that you'd like to kind of say as a final reflection on this topic of pressing the pause button before we finish?
I think just that it's the very nature of having this conversation helps us to think about that, and hopefully all of us are in a position to start exploring more creative ways to help our organisations do that. But thank you for the opportunity to be on the call and to share some of my experiences and thoughts.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I think what's been great is that perspective that you have brought as somebody who operates within a larger organisation, and some of the real successes it sounds like you're having, but also some of the challenges that come in that kind of culture and environment. Thank you very much to everybody who has joined us today. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar if you want to listen to it again, but we'll also email you a link to a survey, which we really, really appreciate you taking the time to fill in, because any feedback that you can give us just helps us to think about how we can improve the way we deliver these webinars. But I think that is the point to draw things to a close. So thank you again to Cara, and goodbye from Neil and I.
Yes, thanks everyone. Goodbye.